This episode of the podcast was originally recorded on February 27th, 2023. I just have to say again, it's really nice to meet you. Thank you for your time today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Really excited.
So, Julia, tell me a little bit about yourself. This is the first time we've ever talked, so.
All right. So I am, I've spent my life working in public policy. So I don't know, maybe I'm a little crazy. I left when I graduated from law school. I went to Springfield and started working as a committee staffer for the Illinois General Assembly, the members of the House. So, when you see like the, when you see like the staffers that run around in the background of Congress, like handing out papers and signs and doing that was my job. I've spent the last 10 years working on various initiatives, generally speaking, all around bringing something new to market. So sort of unprecedented concepts. And I was drawn to the psilocybin issue because I have a sister who was or is personally impacted by this. And psilocybin saved her life. And therefore I'm very motivated to try to help get this legislation passed so that people can access some very critical, whether you want to call it medicine or spirituality,
Sure.
basically what our souls need to survive.
Yeah. Is your sister Ellen or Lauren?
She is, yes.
Gotcha. I was reading your the press release. So for folks that didn't realize what episode they were tuning into, we will be talking about this today. And for folks that aren't watching the video version of the podcast, you can go to chillinois.net/video. Julia, tell us about this. Tell us all about it.
So the Illinois,
really quick.
yeah,
InthioIllinois.org. That's where you're from. That's who you're representing today in a professional capacity. Am I right? Just wanted to get that out there so that people know. So
yeah, we have a couple of calls to action. I love this community because it's so active, and this is one of them. So we are working on House Bill 1, which was introduced to the 193rd General Assembly by LaShawn Ford. The bill does a couple of things. It first of all deschedules psilocybin so that we are removing sort of the criminal penalties that against people who are using this substance. That just feels equitable. And then the next thing that it does is also puts together a regulatory paradigm to bring natural psilocybin to the Illinois market, so that at least sort of the first wave here is a little bit focused on bringing it into to folks who need this as medicine in a setting that is safe, in a setting where it's we've worked on ways to bring costs down, and in ways to make it as accessible as possible.
Very cool. I know a lot of people that are excited about this right now. Sorry, I was just looking for a writing utensil. I don't know where I put my pencil. But anyways, I know a lot of people that are excited about this, and for many different reasons. I have my own reasons. I want to talk first and foremost, if you're okay with this approach, I want to talk first and foremost about the legal option or the regulated option. Would that be a better way of saying it?
So the sort of broader commercial
Yeah,
Would that be? Yeah, sure, for
cool.
sure.
Yeah, so just tell us about a little bit about it. I've got like a vague idea of like what I think it looks like, but please tell people more. I think it's important to maybe start with the fact that you're not just going to be going to a psilocybin dispensary like you do with cannabis and going home and right. So that's I think a number
Correct,
one thing to
correct, correct.
understand.
So I would start by saying that in this, in this world, right, um, in the psychedelic world, there's some people who are amazing specialists at this. Um, and they can grow psilocybin and they have been doing it and they've been using it um, with their community for years. But when we look at the broader public, that knowledge doesn't live with them, and perhaps maybe they don't ever want it to, right? So how do you sort of help those folks? And the notion here is that by creating a process where we have manufacturers who produce psilocybin, a distribution system into these what we call service centers, um, and and then inside of a service center, you would be able to access a sitter. So for the folks who are not psilocybin connoisseurs, which is sort of, you know, uh, um, probably the majority of the population, um, this is a way for them to access psilocybin and access mental well-being, without having to set up a grow facility in their living room.
Very cool. And I think another thing that many people wonder about right off the bat is like, okay, so when we started with medical cannabis, it was this conversation you needed to have with a doctor, and then you needed to get a certification, and then you needed to file that with the state. What is this? It doesn't look like that. And in fact, am I correct in saying that you don't need a certification? You could just
Correct.
say, hey, I want to try psilocybin.
So the yeah. So this is sort of I would call this sort of a natural or organic approach um, to the distribution of the drug that isn't tied directly to, say, a particular mental illness, because I can tell you from my personal family experience, if you have spent any time in the mental health system, um, and someone can't fix you, you just get another diagnosis and another diagnosis and another diagnosis, and it goes on and on and on like that. So while the aim of this is to be therapeutic in nature, what if you're sort of asking how do you balance um, both access and the therapeutic need? Well, it's happening in the actual administration of the drug is happening inside of a service center, and most people that I know, um, if you are seeking that out, you're probably seeking it out for a reason. And so there's I think some natural controls there that make this not wreck, right, but make it also very accessible, without having to jump through some of the onerous hoops that we saw with cannabis.
Yeah. Yeah. And I get what you're saying. Most people that use psilocybin or are looking to try it for the first time are using it because they've heard about its therapeutic effects. But like, are there like if let's just say hypothetically, if I went to a service center, like they're not going to stop me because I don't give them a reason, will they? They'll just say, "Hey, I've got to watch you while you do this," right?
Correct. Bingo. So that that's sort of the balancing act, right?
Okay.
For people who are, as again and again, descheduling is part of this. or maybe it's easier to think of it as decrim. So for the folks who are already really accessing this um, in a way that they've been doing for years and it's safe, um, it this helps provide some legal insulation for those types of communities. We see those types of communities, particularly, for example, around cluster headaches or veteran communities. So we're not taking anything like that off the table. What we're trying to do is expand into another set of folks who really need this, who may not understand um, what it is like to have a mystical experience or how to procure their own sitter. So that's a logic.
Yeah, and I'm glad you just said that because I will say that my listening audience, I'm not sure exactly how, but it seems like maybe they misunderstood. Oh gosh, I just something popped up on my screen and I just lost where I was going there. Oh, they misunderstood the fact or the idea that, let me just put it this way. They were concerned that they would only be able to, let's, for lack of better words, have these rituals in a licensed service center. And from what I understand and from what you just said, hypothetically, the descheduling aspect would provide, like you say, that insulation, not to procure psilocybin, but to still have like a group session like that. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yeah, so it gets down to like personal use, right? We saw this with marijuana,
Right.
right? So, and this applies really across the board with anything. So, even with food, right? We put safeguards in place when someone is going to open a restaurant and they are going to sell a product commercially to the public, right? But we don't tell you how to consume a tomato in your house. So this has sort of that same balancing act where, I'm not jumping into your living room and trying to tell you what to do there. But if you want to commercialize a product, advertise a product, and push it out to the mass public who may not know much about it, there are safety concerns, and just like with a restaurant, you would want to know that it had been produced safely and that you were getting what you were buying.
Yeah. I like the analogy. That makes sense to me. Um, well, so I want to get back to descheduling, and you kind of brought it up, but I want to get back to it. But before we really dive into some of the questions I have about what descheduling actually looks like and means, I wanted to ask, I think, one last question about the regulated option, uh, unless I can think of others. But from what I understand, this bill, like there's two main components, like you said, and please correct me if I'm wrong. There's the legal option, and then there's the descheduling component. So with the legal option, it sounds like it will really be driven and ride on this advisory board. Am I using the right word? Like an advisory board will be created. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. So again, when we think about, providing this in a, a broader context, which we'd like to see. So, lifetime use for psilocybin for folks who are um, over the age of 35 is 2.5%. 19 to 30-year-olds, that number's higher. It's 8.5%. You see a little more acceptance there. But for the folks that sort of grew up, I'm going to just date myself and say, like, I grew up in the Nancy Reagan don't do drugs era, or the folks that are even, a little bit older and came up in the Nixon era of, so psychedelics will make you lose your mind, and you're just very, very lucky if you make it out of the experience without having some kind of permanent brain damage, right? Like that was the narrative for a long, long time. So part of the objective here is to provide a setting for this population who may have some concerns and may have some fears around this, that okay, this is happening in a safe place, and it's administered by someone who has has education on how to administer it. Um, and again, it also comes back to sort of disclosure. You as a consumer, and again, and this applies sort of across the board in the way we treat sort of the distribution of any product. There's more disclosure that's involved in that when you are selling something on a large scale,
Sure.
unless
So
you're the cartel, or and then and then you have a whole nother set of problems.
right, right. Well, that's uh so the thing I heard about this board, it's going to be comprised of like medical professionals, and like you say, it'll provide that oversight and the assurity that maybe people want. But I also heard that it could potentially approve other psychedelic medicines potentially. Am I correct in saying that?
Yes. So I think that the world, and I'm just going to use the global we, for the United States of America. I think like we, as a general rule, know more about psilocybin. I think than most of the other psychedelics that are in the pipeline.
I've
Uh,
even heard, not to cut you off, I've even heard that we know more about psilocybin than we do cannabis. I might be wrong on that, but I've heard that.
Yes, absolutely. Well, let's put it this way. From a scientific perspective, I would sort of break this up, right? So from a public perspective, and then again, this is outside of this audience, right? I interact with people, all day long that are not in this uh, I'll call it sort of subculture.
Demographic.
Yes. And they have no idea what psilocybin does or what the benefits could be, and it's an interesting conversation because they're absolutely shocked to learn that there's that people are not consuming psilocybin and falling prey to all of the propaganda outcomes. So cannabis was unlike that, right? The lifetime usage in the general population of cannabis was much higher. So the general public was had much more knowledge about what the sort of risks and benefits and outcomes were around cannabis or marijuana, however you want to say it. And yet there was less research into it because there just was. I think that the in this particular case, there's a lot of research that we have that's come out. So it's sort of we know more from the scientific community. That that knowledge is it's held within in most cases sort of academic journals. Um, um, you know. Uh, Departments of pharmacology. So I would say there's a lot of science. I don't think it's particularly accessible. And this is interesting because this is where, as I mentioned, my sister has suffered from mental illness throughout her entire life. And this is one of the little projects that I'm working on with her to try to solve this problem of bringing that sort of knowledge into the broader community through the stories of people who have used psilocybin and benefited from it, because we want the general public to understand that this is a positive path for folks. So we're launching thrivestories.org, which is a place where folks who've had personal experiences with use of psilocybin can offer to go and tell that story and contribute to a story library where the information is accessible to the average person, right? Like I always say, when I was sitting in my sister's hospital room, I was not searching for like mystical experiences or, neuroplasticity or increased brain connectivity across, throughout the frontal lobe. This was not what I was doing. I was looking at someone, I was saying, oh my gosh, what data, she's the data I have. What can help her? And then going out and trying to find options. So Thrive Stories is very much about asking the community who has had experiences with psilocybin or other psychedelics to help tell their story, so that when people are looking for a solution, they can find someone who looks and feels sort of like them, and they can then take the next leap, which is, okay, do I want to learn more about this, and do I want to access it myself? So I'm glad you asked the question, because it is a significant difference. There's less sort of, I'll call it, population knowledge than there was around cannabis, but a lot more of sort of deep science knowledge in the psilocybin space. And then part of what we have to do, with our education efforts for the bill, is help people who are not psilocybin connoisseurs understand the impacts and the benefits, and help dispel some of the stigma. I should
It,
not forget to mention that.
yeah. And my bad. I feel like I sent you off on a tangent with that question. And if you did answer the other one, I don't know. I don't feel like I took it home. So the advisory board, can they approve other substances?
Oh, wow. Okay, yes, we would start out with the advisory board. Yes, that is, yeah, that was where we started. Um, we can. That is, it is everything but peyote, which is just excluded for because it's an
Sure.
endangered. Um, they have they are delegated the authority to review those substances, and develop ways to potentially bring them forward. Psilocybin is prioritized, again, because we have the most amount of research on psilocybin. Um, we ask the board to bring that forward first. Um, and then once we've done that and we sort of have a foothold, I think it's important for them to also look at other substances, because when you talk to folks, there's a lot of people who benefit from ayahuasca, for example.
Thank you for clearing that up. And am I correct? I tried to read the bill myself. I'm going to be honest. Legalese is so hard. It's so hard to
Didn't
read.
enjoy the 275 pages of cross references.
Right. Right. Well, so am I correct? And did I take this home correctly? Is the board appointed by the governor,
So these
or who
positions are,
appoints?
yeah, these positions are appointed by the governor. That doesn't happen in a vacuum. So, you know, the it's very much designed for community input. And then there's rule-making processes that happen. And this is sort of, this is standard with any kind of big bill. You don't try to solve all of the nuance inside of the legislative setting. You would be there for eternity. So there is a rulemaking process that happens inside of Illinois. The body is called JCAR, and that promulgates sort of the more nuanced guidelines around how to approach things like, maybe say, the size of a manufacturing plant. So it's not the sexiest of activities sitting on the JCAR panel, but it's very productive, and it's certainly, and I think this is a point that it's worth making to your listeners and your viewers, is that it's not like we move out of the legislative process and it is the last point in time for the community to have an impact on how this rolls out. That also happens inside the executive branch after the legislation has passed.
Gotcha. So I get the impression, based off of conversations I've had in the past, that the board will be comprised of medical professionals, which makes sense. Back to your point of, you know, having broader out. I can't think of the words right now, but broad acceptance. How about that? Is that good? Do you think that's what I'm? Yeah. So
Share
obviously
the
that,
message of psilocybin with the world.
right. And well, and you want somebody that has, you know, credentials that they can, back up and say, "Hey, I'm a certified health professional," right? I feel like that would go a long way towards giving everybody a little bit of peace of mind.
I will,
Um,
I'll just interject there that, health is mentioned in the bill, but so is spirituality and community use. All of those things are in the bill. The, um, just as the way sort of, the order of operations in government goes, um, medical practices are regulated at the state level. And so this is a sort of standard practice, but it's not limited to medical professionals. There's community profession or community representatives. There's people who are there to talk about access, people to represent. Um, well, as I part of what's happening here is bringing sitters into the equation, right? Like that is not part of our existing paradigm, at least not part of our existing paradigm, should I say, in a state regulatory setting. And so, and I know the notion of regulation scares people, but it's a way to, I would like to say it's a way of honoring um, what has been happening at the community level for hundreds of years, and we are asking the government to say yes, this makes sense, and yes, we are willing to take a different view of how we can achieve some mental well-being, and that includes sitters that are not necessarily don't have like 5 PhDs. So
yeah, yeah. So I was wrapping around to that. That's kind of where I was going. Is like, of course, and I'm fine with medical professionals. I think that adds a level of legitimacy. But I wondered, on the board, will there be specific like spots? It sounded like you just said there would be, for like community members or people to represent the spiritual side of it versus the medicine side of it, because that is a big thing with this community. I mean, you just touched on it, the
yeah,
medicine versus spirituality thing.
yes, yes, and I think that this is an important point to around education. I think it it is easier to start educating legislators around sort of the core medical benefits, right? Um, because that is the way we're used to thinking about drugs. And then it sort of bridges the gap into, or bridges, yeah, that gap into what is spirituality, or what I would call, if you wanted to reframe it, well-being. And one of the things we know about psychedelics that makes them different from um, um, substances that we have, sort of used in the past, is that they don't just help um, depress, all I call it ill being, they actually help increase well-being, which is, I mean, that's really amazing. I don't know. Um, so my new role has forced me to read a heck of a lot more clinical studies than I wish I ever had, uh, because I obviously just need to be aware of what's happening in the world out there. And there's a really fascinating in population study with LSD in Australia, where 1,000 people were offered microdoses of LSD, and they came back and they reported on and this was the in population healthy study, right? So your neighbor, me, whatever, I don't know. Um, and every metric of well-being increased with the microdosing. So whether it was engaging in physical activity, making choices to be in nature, for marriages, more sex. Yeah, that was one of the things I studied. Um, Happiness at work, creativity, all of these things went up. Now, our bill in Illinois is focused on natural substances. LSD is sort of two derivatives away from a chemical standpoint, but it becomes easier to have conversations with people in decision making positions. We sort of start from the most what I would call needy um, base point, right? And then start, once people have become comfortable and familiar with the concept of, okay, we don't want people to just survive. We want them to thrive. We want them to reach their maximum potential. Then we can start having those conversations about well-being and sort of integrating that into the common vernacular of folks inside of our decision makers inside of our states who should understand that component of it. And spirituality is very much a portion of that.
Gotcha. So there will be spots for people like
Yes,
that on the
back to
board.
the spots. Yes, yes, yes. Back to the spots. Absolutely, that's in there. And also opportunities for feedback. So
I
it's
know I'm
it's a
going out on a limb with this one, but is it like half and half, or like is it just like a couple spots, or like what does it look like?
so so where a bill starts, I'll just preface
No,
this with
and thank you.
where a
I
bill
actually
starts
one of
and
the things
where a bill ends.
right, one of the things I actually was told that you would be able to tell me is like, yeah, how a bill becomes a law, which is important. So
Okay, so yes, where a bill starts and where a bill ends are very, very different things. So right now it's a blend of community members and physicians and sort of healers. And so it's all of the above. And I can't tell you right offhand what the ratio is of that. I'd be happy to come back and give you the breakdown. But that's where it is right now. And then of course, what we will do as we move through the process is have conversations like the one that we're having right now, get feedback from community members, and if your listeners are very interested in having another stakeholder at the table, um, that is absolutely the type of feedback we love to hear. It's much easier to do it on the front end than it is to, do on the back end. Although both are possible, and I've done both. So,
yeah.
uh,
Yeah, I asked that question just because I think it would go a long way towards gaining that community support for, so it's like we're trying to step around two different issues. You have this one crowd that's possibly not knowledgeable on psilocybin, and you have to battle that drug war era information, right? With the correct information, which is that this is what did you say? A substance that can lead to like well-being overwhelmingly, versus another group of people, and you might say that this is some of my audience, who are hesitant. They don't want it to, they want it to be, they're fine. I like personally, I'm not opposed to a regulated option, but one of the main things, and we'll get to this in descheduling, that I've opposed with cannabis is that we legalized it, yet people can't grow their own, right? Or the possession limits are really limited, and there's still criminal penalties for it. So like I say, that's one of the big mistakes I feel like we made with the Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act. And so these questions are kind of coming in the spirit of that. Like we're trying to learn what happened with cannabis and apply that to psilocybin, I guess. So
Yes, there are a lot of lessons to be learned on with cannabis, all across the board, from, initial access to equity to how do you solve for, um, you actually have to have a market uh, out there for people to access, and that, it certainly did not exist for cannabis. So all of those are relevant to the language of the bill, and also the community engagement with your own legislators around what you want to see. Um, I, 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 where is that? Can you pop up that
oh
letter?
yeah, the press release.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
so do we go? All right, I'll have to get it to you guys. This is not it.
Mm,
We have a letter that is drafted for folks to send to their legislators, asking their legislators to come on as proponents of the bill. So if I can I'll get you that web
sure.
address so you can post it, and and engage and express your opinions about this, because it's important for them to hear. Um, this is certainly a group that is above average on their knowledge about the substance, and elected officials are humans. Eh, some people disagree with me on that, but I assure you, I've been working with them for years. They are human, and they absolutely respond to their constituents and what their constituents want, and the very human aspect of engaging them. Um, they are. Um, Generally speaking, empaths. So feel free, and I encourage you to reach out, because it will both help us perpetuate the bill, also educate folks.
Yeah. So for folks that want to see that, we'll put that link in the podcast description. I'll just follow up with you after the show to get that. And really quick, folks, we've got a few links in the podcast description. We've got entheoill.org. We've got a link to the press release that you saw. We've got a link to thrivestories.org. Is that correct? Thrivestories.org. We'll have that in the podcast description, as well as the link we just referenced. So I feel like I only have maybe like one more question about the legal option, and then we can wrap up with descheduling, if that sounds all right.
By
So
all means.
cool. What does licensing look like? You brought up a market. That's a big question that we got when we talked about discussing this bill. They're like, what does licensing look like? Again, that's a big complaint with coming from cannabis, that basically there's not an option for small time farmers, and there's plenty of barriers to entry. So yeah, I'm curious, what does that look like?
Um, so so we did learn some things in cannabis. One of them being that craft cannabis growers have done really, really well. They've been really successful. That was sort of an afterthought. And these are the folks that have come forward with some, I think, of the more interesting strains, and because they're deeply invested in the plant, and they're farmers. So leveraging some of that knowledge and bringing it into this bill is certainly an objective. We've tried to streamline some of the permitting processes, so that the market is just less it was disjointed in cannabis, and so there's options here for sort of syncing things up and making it simpler. So that's there. I can't tell you exactly what will be in the permitting process now, because the vast majority of that gets decided in rules. So that here we go back to the rulemaking process. Yes. So that happens sort of inside of the executive branch, because they're the ones who review, administer, and approve. I'm going to be positive and say approve the licenses. So more to come there. Stay tuned. Um, and was there a second part of, was that a compound question? Did I need
Sorry,
a?
I did say a lot, but it was really the question was, yeah, what does licensing look like, and will perhaps there be a mixture of small time, mid time, big time people, right?
Yes. So yes, the design is to be inclusive and integrate the lessons that we learned from the cannabis world. Um, some of that happens at the legislative level. As I said, the integrated license concept is something that we learned from cannabis, that is in the psilocybin bill. The What happens inside of the permitting system is that that feedback comes later in the process inside of, and again, it's not without public comment or public participation. It is that is built into the rulemaking process. And then of course I think there's just some human error that happened in cannabis, that will hopefully not repeat because no one liked it.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I guess I know I said I had one last question, but you just kind of brought up a thought. There's no mention of social equity in this bill.
So,
I'm just curious what.
um, so there, some of the so equity is always a question and always a concern. Um, the coalition itself, NPO Illinois, has done an excellent job of being inclusive in terms of bringing in stakeholders, and um, that is, that's relevant for just in general how this gets rolled out. Um, the it at the moment doesn't have the same sort of set asides, and we'll sort of see how that progresses in the legislative process. Um, here's a little bit of a slightly different dynamic here, and how some people want to look at it, because there's sort of a much smaller use population. um, we don't have we don't have to sort of try to pry people out of jail, the same way we were. I mean, yes, it's a controlled substance. Yes, there are probably people out there who have, I know there are people out there who have faced criminalization over this. There's no doubt about it. Um, Everything with psilocybin is sort of just a little bit smaller because it is, less pervasive in our just everyday lifetime use as a nation.
Gotcha.
I guess the Nixon propaganda really worked.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Well, I just thought that was notable. I mean, I personally, I think I want to be very clear that I support the idea of social equity, but I personally feel it's just become a political buzzword, and cannabis is a case, and like is a case that I point to in Illinois as an example of that. So I just thought it was notable that the bill, like I'm not saying good or bad that it doesn't mention it. I just thought it was notable. So
I
um
would say, there's different ways of approaching this issue. So, you know, I, this is an issue that's near and dear to my heart from the perspective of women. So, as I said, you know, I spent months in my sister's hospital room searching up and down for something that would help her. I never really made the connection that something that would help, say, a an athlete who had CTBI or a combat um, uh, related PTSD case could help her, because in my mind she looked different, right, or her story sounded different. And so part of the education component that I feel very, very passionate about is making sure that we are talking to all of the communities throughout the legislative process. It's part of the idea behind Thrive, is to try to represent those communities as they exist in the world. So the stories sort of tell, you know, what's really happening out there in our everyday life. Because I, because it is absolutely true that who you talk to during a legislative process does have an influence on who will access um, what you eventually bring to market, if however you want to put market, whether it's the descheduling or the broader market.
Cool. Well, yeah, I think that's perfect. Let's talk about descheduling. What does that mean? To break it down for people. I mean, earlier you mentioned, you said it removes criminal penalties for use, but I'm under the impression that that's not it. Is that correct?
So descheduling in this respect is it is it is designed for to remove the criminal penalties, yes, for personal use, absolutely. It says very specifically that you may have psilocybin for your personal consumption, and that you um, and so that is part of it. It also is designed to facilitate research, because it's very hard to overcome some of the barriers.
Right.
Um,
I didn't
it's
think about that actually until you just said that. That's brilliant.
Yeah, yeah. And we would like people, one of the industry dynamics that's a real challenge here is that the research tends to be done on synthetic psilocybin, because that is what we can patent. And I say global we as the United States. But I think there is a lot of interest in research on naturals. Um, Question mark about whether or not we should be, I guess I- I'll say anyone who wants to play in this market and help people achieve well-being, I go for it. But I do think that there's some of us who look at it and say, are we reinventing the wheel? And and I'll leave it at that.
Sure. Yeah. It's a good way of looking at it. So am I correct to understand that the descheduling would also make it so that I could cultivate psilocybin at home um,
For your personal use.
for personal use? Nice. Am I also under the understanding that I could gift psilocybin? No money is involved, but I could like say, hey, here are some of my shiitake mushrooms that I acquired from where the market, and I also cultivated some psilocybin mushrooms. Julia, here you go. Like you do with
Okay.
tomatoes.
So now you're asking, so this is you're tugging me in two directions, right? From like, yes, that's exactly what the bill says. I would also say I'm a lawyer, so be somewhat cautious. People, uh, I wouldn't suggest, um, growing uh, five
Well,
thousand
just
pounds
like
of
tomatoes.
psilocybin in
I
your.
mean,
Yeah, I wouldn't suggest growing 5,000 pounds of psilocybin in your house and then having a party for 200 of your nearest and dearest friends and charging a $500 over or entry fee. So it that again, that's just the lawyer side of me. Make sure it really is for your personal use or for the consumption of people that are in your sort of immediate circle. It's not, it is not. I The commercial, or I should say, the larger commercial aspects, um, are there to protect people who do not have an expertise in this. So again, it's a balancing of the scales. Yes, we want you to be able to do what you're doing, and we also want people who have less education to come into this world from a safe and transparent entryway.
Hmm. So what do the criminal penalties look like if I sold psilocybin without a license?
That will have to be resolved in the throughout the whole evolution of the bill. I mean, right now, you are looking at psilocybin being deprioritized for personal consumption at the federal level, descheduling within Illinois. So I, that's where it stands right now. And we will, we'll sort of see as it progresses. But I'll sort of return to my first comment, which is we understand community use. We value community use. We do not want to interfere with community use. So, that's that.
Yeah. I look, I would say that just like you said earlier, I think you started the show with this idea, which is like you can open I could have you and your sister and some other folks over for dinner, and that's not a problem, right? But if I start a Facebook page that says Cole Preston's Chillinois restaurant and I don't have all of the licensing, like that's a different thing. You know what I mean? So
Well,
I'm not talking
yeah,
about like large scale, but I'm
right.
just saying what because there are criminal penalties that exist today, and we're talking about removing a lot of them. But it sounds like we're considering, or there's a possibility of keeping some of them. And my question is, what are they?
Um, so I mean, it would sort of get back to the restaurant analogy is a good one. What are the consequences for running an unlicensed restaurant and advertising it to the world? Um, there are consequences.
Are there criminal consequences, or are there just like tax consequences or like licensing consequences?
Now we're really getting deep into the law. So it would depend on how you did it.
Sure.
I would
Fair
have to
enough.
leave it at that, right? How big you did it. um, you know, we,
What I
we,
was doing, if I
we
was like maybe laundering money or whatever.
yeah, all of those things. Did you poison someone? Then
Hmm.
like, did someone die in your
But you
living?
get my question. You get where I'm coming from.
Yes. Unfortunately, that cues up a whole lot of potential legal outcomes, but um, they apply in any setting, right? Like they apply any unlicensed business. Um, that's my
Yeah.
best. That's my best answer without having the facts of the case in front of me.
Sure. I guess what I this
But
was my last.
let's really zero in on this.
Yeah.
It is it is not designed to go into your living room and tell you what you should or should not be doing inside of your, personal community. That
Hmm.
is not what bill is designed very specifically to to pre- to prevent someone from being criminalized in those circumstances, because we know that there is community use. We know that it's important. And we know that, and it is something that we want to preserve.
Yeah. Yeah. And I really appreciate the sentiment there. I just hope you get where I'm coming from on it. Like if it's like I'm just trying to figure out, are we gonna? I'm not saying we let the big scale growing, but it's like, is there going to be any lessening of the penalties that exist? And it sounds like you don't have the answer, and that's okay. It's another thing I can follow up on.
Well, yes, lessening in the penalties comes along with descheduling.
But okay, that's what I'm saying. So there's no penalty for possession, no penalty for cultivation, but I could pull up the Controlled Substances Act right now. I'm sure there's penalties for selling it, and I'm sure it's a graduated scale, just like we have with cannabis, where it's like, okay, if you did this amount, then it's this. If you did this amount, then it's this. My question is, those lower amounts, are we going to see any, is it going to just remain iron fist, you're going to jail like it is today, or are we going to see that be a little bit less of a harsh penalty as it should be?
Yes, the purpose of as I said, the purpose is to protect people's personal consumption of their own product, and
Hmm.
that is the design. So that this is an environment where um, um, you shouldn't you shouldn't be you should not be penalized for what's happening inside of your living room.
Yeah. Now, having said all of that, I realize what we're dealing with is a little bit bigger than just this issue. So I wanted to ask you, what is the political what do you feel the political landscape is in Illinois, and how does the how does the public play a part in the process of a like grassroots initiative like this?
Uh, you guys make all the difference. It's very, very important. I would encourage anyone here who is interested in the policy side to go to entheoillinois.org, become a member. You can join for as little as like $5 a month, I want to say, and get all of the information on. We sort of help streamline advocacy and reaching out to elected officials. Um, the the advocacy efforts of this community and really anyone in Illinois they're going to be the make or break. This is what we call a member initiative, meaning that it was brought forward by LaShawn Ford because he sort of heard what was happening and that people um, needed access to these substances. And for member initiatives, there is nothing that's more important than the community. That's where they come from. That's where they grow from. And every single time someone reaches out to their state rep and says, "I want to see this happen," we are that much closer to having a bill pass.
Yeah. And maybe this can go back to my question about, I'm sorry, I threw two questions at you. I've done that twice to you now. I apologize. Um,
The
but
political landscape is that.
yeah, the political landscape, like what do you think the prospects are high? Why is LaShawn Ford the right sponsor for the bill? There I go again. I just threw two questions at you. Political landscape, and why is LaShawn Ford the right person why is he the right person?
So um LaShawn is great. He is, very forward thinking legislator. And one of the things that and he's working this bill very hard. So send him a message and say thank you. People know, people in government love to know that what they're doing matters to you. Um, the
And more
landscape.
often they hear complaints than they do a thank you.
Yes, yes. They hear a lot of complaints and not a whole lot of thank yous. You will get a lot. This is a place where honey is. What's the saying? Honey is better than vinegar. Yeah. Um, I I might have just gone really old school with that one. Um, the political landscape. I will say Illinois tends to be a progressive state. Um, and so that, that weighs in our favor. There is a lot of education that needs to be done. So even for a progressive state, um, y- there's a community of folks who really understand this issue well, and a lot of people who really don't. And so educating members is the most important thing that can happen. Even if the state has, a baseline that I would say is positive and favorable, it will not happen without the outreach and the engagement of the community. So I encourage people to get involved, stay involved, make your voice known, because that that is the secret sauce for starting a movement, an effective movement.
Yeah. And I think another component of this, I'm curious what your take is on this idea. I mean, I've seen the governor's office kind of, for lack of better words, pledge support for certain initiatives. I think, like, for example, before the CRTA was actually passed, JB Pritzker's made some statements that, like, hey, this is looking good. I like what I'm hearing, type of thing. What my question is, what kind of support do you think we would need, using the proverbial we, from the governor's office on this issue?
Um, oh gosh, I dare not speculate on that one. The you know that is getting into the head of a one person trying to guess. Um, but I'll say governors are elected officials, just like state reps are, and
Yeah.
so if you want to see your governor engaged around this issue, reach out.
Hell yeah. Good advice. Good advice. Well, um, is there anything, I'll start to close the show. Are you good on time, by the way, to go a little bit longer?
Yeah.
Cool. I was just curious to hear a little bit more about your experience, like, with your former job. You had jumped right into the Cure Act. I was gonna kind of give you an opportunity to tell a little bit more of your backstory. But before we do that, and that'll be the way we close the show. Um, look, I like the descheduling component of this bill. I like it a lot. In fact, I think it does. I think the changes are more substantive than what we did with cannabis with regard to the goal, which is to stop criminalizing the substance, right? I think that from what I'm hearing with descheduling, this goes further. I just need more answers on the legal component. And I understand, please correct me if I'm wrong, but there would be more public input and stuff. Like, this isn't the end, because I don't know. I need to know about the makeup of the committee. I hold on. It's not that I need to know. We need to know. The public needs to know about the makeup of the committee, what the market is going to look like. Because frankly, and maybe this is where we wrap up. I mean, of course, you still have your thoughts, but, like, I feel like the descheduling component, the other reason that I like it so much is because it sounds like it could supply for the, let's say, uh lack of access. Like, I don't know. I just feel like the legal option sounds like it, and it sounds like it's only for people that could afford that or could do something like that. And it just seems like people that need psilocybin maybe can't or don't
Yes.
have those opportunities. So
So yes, absolutely. That is part of the objective there. I mean, we do realize that there are financial barriers, and the and descheduling is designed to help those folks who experience those financial barriers. That's a very important point. I appreciate that you brought it up.
do you have concerns about that component of the bill? Do you think it's too liberal?
Do I think it's too liberal? Uh,
I'm just saying, if somebody who opposes this listens to this, Just saying.
I would be a hypocrite if I said that. My family member is alive um, because somebody in Colorado was kind enough to go out into the woods and find magic mushrooms for her and bring them to us at a time where, the vast majority of the medical community thought that she was going to be dead in 5 years. I can't. I would be. I would be a horrible hypocrite if I thought that the person who saved my sister's life should face criminal penalties.
Thank you for addressing that. While it might seem like when you look at the logo, it's like, oh, nobody that's conservative on this issue will listen. No, in fact, I think they do. We've had people from the number one lobbying group against the legalization of cannabis. Like, look, I'm fair and I try to be fair with regard to, who I talk to. And the reason I bring up that question is because it's been in the back of my mind. Look, I worry sometimes that we're in this like echo chamber, And so to somebody who's not in our demographic, as we said at the beginning, I wonder how digestible this proposal is. For me, for me and you, we're like, fuck yeah, this is great. But
It's why it's really important to reach out and help folks understand the basics of the substance. You know, um,
yeah,
it's non-toxic, it's non-lethal. You can have a really bad day, and I'm not saying that there aren't risks, right? I think uh, that psychedelics are a class of drugs to be respected. Um, but the risks are not the risks that were presented to us in the, here's your brain on drugs, with the egg. Does anyone remember that? Okay. Those are not the risks. And it is, um, it is critically important to have that conversation because um, there are a lot of people who have been propagandized and helping them understand the realities of psychedelics versus what they heard in sort of it was just an unfortunate um, political maneuvering that was not terribly ethical um, back in the 70s. uh, we have to work to overcome that messaging because it's been embedded for 40 years. But um, fundamentally non-toxic, non-lethal. This is a message that we keep carrying forward, and also helping people understand the well-being components of this. For anyone who's from someone who's really really suffering to someone who just wants to maybe just is trying to overcome you know whatever I'll say hardship is happening in their existing life, or people who are just seeking a higher sort of spiritual connection to this world. All of those things are valid.
yeah.
Those things
Thank
should
you.
be embraced.
Thank you for addressing potential critics, and I like that you mentioned that if anybody does feel uncomfortable with this bill, that they, I think maybe more so than anybody else, should get involved in airing their feedback so that it can be addressed, right?
Yeah,
Um, right? I
yeah.
mean,
I mean, that's the that's the whole political process. We won't convince everyone
sure.
in, and that's a reality. But we can help re-educate. Um, we can help re-educate uh, folks and bring them into the fold. I am a perfect testament to someone who was re-educated. When my sister initially brought this to me, I was like, like my head like probably could have exploded. And but I looked at it and I said, all right, I'm listening here. Tell me more. And I read about it and discovered it was psilocybin was completely different than what I had been told for, my formative years. And it changed my mind. This is how we change people's minds and their hearts. We first present them with the evidence of what this really is, and then we tell them the importance of why. And so that's the magic equation, changing hearts and minds.
Yeah. Well, very well said. Well, any last thoughts on the Cure Act before we close? Did we miss any bases? Did you feel we covered them all?
Oh, I think we've done well. We've
Yeah, I
done
think
well. All I would say is, and I will say this over and over again, please, please stay engaged. Um, you know, the the folks at Entheo have lots of tools to remain engaged, and we need help reaching out to your friends, your family members, your you know uh, whoever it is that's in your life. Be an evangelist, because that is, um, this is a government that is designed to listen to people. So the
yeah,
more we can have folks who are in the sphere of understanding, in a place where their hearts are open, the better we are all off. So yeah.
yeah, totally agreed there. And I think the only thing I thought about that I feel like we haven't covered is expungements. Do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, that's a pretty big part of the bill. Am I wrong that that's part of the bill?
So I'd have to circle back on expungements.
Okay,
I'm sure that it's in. Yeah, I would be. Don't quote me on this one. So I'll have to circle back and look at expungements.
sure.
But generally speaking, there's expungement processes throughout our criminal code. So that is always it, they've always existed.
Awesome.
Somewhat well hidden, maybe, but they're there.
Okay. Well, I can definitely follow up on that. Well, sweet. Thank you. I had a lot of fun during that discussion, and I'm so interested to hear about and I know that we have about 40 minutes left in our time slot. I don't think we need to use the rest of that, but um if we need to, we can. But I'm just curious to hear about your beginnings. You mentioned like running papers in and out. Like what was that like, and what did that actually include? Like, were you fielding like the phone calls that we were just recommending people to make, so that you're running in papers to the representative saying like, oh, this is what your people feel about this, or like what did you do and what was that like?
So yes, I I worked specifically on drafting legislation, so that was my initial start. So integrating feedback from the community, just to give you an idea of how this looks from a legislator's eyes. There's a bill analysis that sort of tells them what happens inside of a bill, and then there's a section that's down there at the bottom that says, who's for or against this particular bill. That is always a really important section for legislators. So if you know organizations that are willing to come on as proponents of the bill, absolutely please reach out to Entheo and let us know. The other thing that they so that happens at the beginning of the process, and then the next stage is to move it to committee, and that's where witness slips come in. Witness slips go on record, and they're read out to the committee members as you are just about to go up and testify for your bills. So it's great to have witness slips because it really shows momentum. And then the next stage after that, the bill will come out of committee and it will go to what's called a floor vote. And a floor vote is the time where I generally ask, um, again, the broadest possible community to mobilize and reach out directly to their individual legislator, because whether or not someone, if you hit a threshold of about, say, 5 touches per legislator, um, that is, I mean, that can be a real tipping point from a just sort of a practical perspective inside of any bill that's moving through the legislative process. And then we start all over in the Senate. But right now we're in committee, so slips are great. And then if we come back to you, oh no, oh, there you are. Okay.
I was just showing you
You're
mentioned
just
witness
showing the
slips.
slip. Yeah. And then if we come back to you in a few weeks and ask you to send another letter or make another phone call to your rep, it is because we are trying to move it from committee, and it's gone from committee and we're trying to move it off the House floor. And that's, again, sort of the big push. So I'd also like to say, yeah, we're not just like pinging you for, you know, willy-nilly. It correlates to how any piece of legislation moves through this process, and what legislators need to hear from their constituents as the process evolves.
Very cool. Very cool. What was sorry, I brought up the witness slips just because if I can share this for folks that are listening or watching. So if you're watching right now, you can see I'm sharing Inthio, Illinois' Instagram page, and it's an action alert that basically walks you through how to file a witness slip for this bill. So if you're listening right now and you can't see this, or if you're watching and you'd rather look at this on your own computer, I'll throw a link to this post in the podcast description so that you can follow the instructions and file a witness slip. So thanks for sharing that knowledge, by the way.
Yeah, it's very easy. It's a quick process. So
Yeah. So again, I don't feel I need to apologize for bringing that up, but I did take you off of your experience there for a moment.
oh, my experience. So what did I do
Yeah.
after that? Then I went and I worked for various elected officials running their public policy departments. So inside of um, inside of government, working with grassroots organizers and um, other departments and stakeholders to advance legislative initiatives. So that's been my whole career. And then when this popped up, I said, well, this is certainly something that is worth advocating for. And I contacted LaShawn and said, what can I do? And again, elected officials are very responsive to your human stories. I explained how this was so relevant to me and my family, and said, we're willing to go on record. We're willing to tell this story to the public if that's what is needed. And I should say, I know that's what's needed. I know what's needed is that we share our stories, our shared experiences with our elected leaders, because they listen. They listen, and they will do something. And I can say that from the perspective of having been on the inside and receiving these phone calls and hearing people talk about what impacts their lives. It's very, very meaningful to advancing legislation, especially when an idea is kind of new. I mean, it's sort of old and new at the same time, but
Yeah.
it's new to some people, even though we've been using psilocybin for thousands of years.
So do you just like enjoy this job? Like or what you do? Because it sat like, honestly, from an outsider's perspective, that sounds really like you've done a lot of really stressful things.
I did have a personality test done, and it's funny. I came up very low on the fear um,
Okay, that makes
uh,
sense.
scale. I came up very low on the fear and scale, and have a high tolerance for uncertainty. So I guess that's what makes me tick in this world. But yes, it's a pressure cooker. So be nice to people when you reach out to them, because it certainly is. It's it's difficult to. At one point, I was working as head of policy for a large agency in the city of Chicago. I was like, oh, I only have 3 million clients.
Yeah.
Uh, but the more we hear from you, the better it is, because that's how um, that's how we're able to um, form the narrative that carries this forward, and that
Yeah.
narrative is very important.
So I've got an interesting question for you specifically about like LaShawn Ford. And I'm just curious, like with your experience, how I would go about approaching something like this. Like as an individual, I am an individual. I don't have like I've got my Patreon subscribers. Thank you, by the way, folks. Thank you so much. You can pay $3 a month. That's all it is at chillinois.net/Patreon, and you get exclusive access to new episodes of the podcast. So thank you to the folks that subscribe. But like I barely make ends meet with that. But here's the thing. I've seen LaShawn Ford put forth several pieces of legislation that are backed by industry players, specifically within the cannabis industry. And it's like, it's public knowledge that he takes money from cannabis companies. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. What I'm saying is it's probably no coincidence that he introduces legislation that they support. And so I guess what I'm asking is, as a cannabis consumer, what do you think, how best do you think it would be for me to approach somebody like him, who's not my elected representative, but is somebody that champions these causes, right? And how do you think I would get his support? Because like one of the things you mentioned earlier was like, say thank you when you can, because they very rarely hear that. They only hear about complaints. But like I'm trying to figure out how I would best approach somebody like that, seeing as I don't necessarily have maybe the capital to get his attention or anything else.
So, reaching out to your own legislator and asking them to sponsor someone else's or co-sponsor someone else's bill. And I don't know how much you want to nerd out on legislation, but
Let's do it.
okay, we'll nerd out on
I'm
legislation.
trying to learn. I want to be helpful to my elected representatives, and I want my audience to learn too. I don't want people to just be calling them and screaming like help us help you, right?
Yeah. Okay. So the way it works is that uh, a legislator introduces a bill, and when they introduce it, they're sort of out there on their own, and they're a little bit nervous, right? They've just put their name on an idea, and and put it into the public sphere, and they don't know how people are going to respond. And so one of the best things that you can do if you see something that you like is ask your elected official in your district to co-sponsor that bill, because what you want by the time you get to committee or to a floor vote, you want to see this steady increase in the number of co-sponsors that come onto a bill. So, it's very meaningful, because it adds more resources to the bill just from an internal perspective. Right now, you don't just have one state rep working on it with one team. You have typically each bill has four what they call lead sponsors, and then everyone else can come on as a just a normal sponsor. But those sort of lead sponsors, those four lead people, will throw a lot of resources into passing a bill once it has some momentum. So you can have a very, very significant impact on a bill that's being run by someone outside of your rep district by asking your rep to go on as a co-sponsor.
I appreciate that information. That's like really huge. And I think it'd be huge, like, especially if I lived where I used to live, which is Champaign, Urbana. Uh, I had a representative that was super pro home grow, which is the issue that I would personally love to become. Like, we need to legalize home grow for cannabis. Like, it's past time. I thought, if the plant's legal, right, we should be able to do that. So that's my perspective on that issue. And so unfortunately, I don't live there anymore. So consider my situation anecdotal, but what do I do in this situation? Because my representative is a big no for cannabis. I was able to get him one time to agree that the police shouldn't have access to the cannabis data, because he agreed with that in principle, but he still didn't agree with cannabis legalization on like a personal level. So where do I
Right, just get
go when my
out of
representative? Sorry.
what to do with opponents.
Yeah.
So I guess the answer is that if your rep
I know this is a tough question, by the
does
way.
it,
It's kind of unique to myself, but
I'll answer it globally though. Okay.
sure.
Um, even if your even if your rep isn't going to do what you ask them to do right now, um, having that engagement sets the stage for how aggressively they might fight against someone else who would be interested in doing it. It also, having the engagement around these types of issues sets the stage for what they might do in the future with another bill. Perhaps, they won't vote against it, they'll just abstain. So having those, I think it can feel like you're having a conversation with a brick wall, and that's that's an unfortunate feeling, but I can tell you, having been on the inside, that you listen both to the people who support what you're doing and don't support what you're doing. Um, and those things have an influence on where you go. Maybe you're sort of committed to this particular path at this particular moment, but it certainly influences how you think about what you're going to do in the future. So um, you know, there is no bad time to engage your elected officials.
Sorry, I'm muted. Thank you for going on that big tangent with me as well. Just to wrap up, through all those experiences, how did you find yourself at Entheo, Illinois?
uh,
I wanted to allow you to to kind of wrap up your story. I felt like I kind of interjected while you were still telling it. So
yeah, and I mean, it was as simple as I had, I spent the first 2.5 decades of my life being convinced that, terrified of my phone, because one day that call was coming, and um, it was a horrible way to live, and it's not a way anyone should have to live. And then we sort of discovered psilocybin, and there was um, one, a certain level of my God, I have to get the word out there, because my sister made a very serious attempt where her chances of survival were less than 1%. And um, and how and why are we keeping this a secret? um, just just befuddled me. So as soon as there was an opportunity to help advance the cause and try to do it with some of the resources that we already had in hand. Try to make it as accessible as possible. I just raised my hand. I'm doing this as a volunteer. So this is not my this isn't my full-time job, but it's where my heart is because it is morally right.
So I just want to thank you and your sister for doing what you can to advance the cause. From what I can tell in this press release, if I'm recalling correctly, yeah, um, she's been through a lot, let's just say. And to kind of publicly come out and talk about that, I'll just keep it short and saying thank you for doing what you can to advance the cause and being open about the story, you know.
Well, thank you. Thank you for helping me and my family. So we're all connected, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I guess just to close, so these I'm gonna share what I have that I'll send you as follow-up questions. Oh, whoops. Is this sharing? Yes, it is. So for follow-up, I've got, oh, I was talking away from the microphone. What is the makeup of the committee? And I don't mean to phrase the question this way exactly, but do you get what I'm saying? Like, what is the makeup gonna look like versus spiritual versus medicine, for lack of better words? Like it, or is there an outlined, so that's what, but do you
Is
get where
there
I'm
there's a question about is there a difference, right?
right, right.
Our spirits, the medicine feeds our spirits,
Yeah.
there's a reason we called them shamans and medicine women and medicine men for so many years. But I hear your question.
Yeah. And do you understand, like, can I just personally ask you, do you get why these questions are so important to the community?
Yeah, absolutely.
I just wanted to, make sure that it was understood like that, I'm speaking on behalf of myself a little bit, but definitely my audience too. We, like you say, we're all in this together and we've had this shared experience with other things that have not gone well. And so I want to be very clear. I do not want perfection to be the enemy of progress, right? I think I support this bill. I have a lot of those questions are very important to me though. I need an answer on those. But I feel like I support the bill. So, um,
Well, thank you. Yeah, and I guess the answers to some of those questions end up playing out depending on who shows up and what they say throughout the process. I mean, I'm not the ultimate decider, right?
sure.
I am. I don't get to vote on this. Um, as a individual, all I can do is reach out to my rep, which I have, and express my opinions and my experiences. And that's the power of every single person that's in this community. And one of the wonderful things about this community is that it's so tight knit and people are so invested and they're engaged, and that's what makes or breaks a piece of legislation, especially a piece of legislation like this that's sort of pushing a new frontier, at least at at the state level.
Yeah. And I'm glad you said that too, by the way, that, especially for our listening audience, like I already understood that, but yeah, you're not the make or break on this. I'll still follow up with you to see what you can find since you know some of the makers, breakers, and shakers involved with this thing, right? But like, yeah, for folks that also see the importance behind these questions, I would encourage you to reach out to your local representatives to ask these same questions if they mean as much as they do to you as they do to me. And if, of course, if you have other questions, send them their way. And if critics are still listening right now, first of all, you're awesome for listening this far in. But also, you should participate in the process as well. If you have concerns, let's figure out how we can address them because I'm sure we can. So, with that, Julia, it has been a pleasure. I've really I've enjoyed our talk today. I could see myself wanting to invite you on again in the future, maybe not to talk about this so much as just you have a lot of insight into how this actually works. And admittedly, I lack that. Like you know, I roughly understand how a bill becomes a law. Like if you pop quiz me, I don't know that I'd completely fail it, but I would be willing to bet that most people I'd be willing to bet that most people don't, including maybe even some people that are involved at that scale. So whatever I can do to help like educate people to, like I said, it's like in the spirit of help us help our representatives, right? We want to be communicating with them in a way that makes sense. We don't want to be over communicating because then, saturation and such. Like I want to shepherd a good relationship between the citizen and their elected representative. And I guess what I'm saying is I think that in the future, maybe you and I could work together to continue that. So
We can do some civics classes.
seriously, no, I mean, I was talking to the CROO, the Cannabis Regulation Oversight Officer office, and at one time they were going to come on my show and talk about how things become a bill and how it goes through committees and what rule writing looks like. Like, I'm serious. If you'd be willing to talk about that sometime, I personally, I know it's a nerdy thing. I personally would find it interesting, and I think there's a subsect
I'm
of
a
our
public
audience that would too.
policy, so we can do that.
Cool.
Let's consider it a date.
Cool. We'll make it happen. All right. Well, Julia, again, it's been a pleasure. We've got the links in the podcast description for the website, the social media, different things we mentioned today. Is there anything else you want to mention before we go?
Thank you for having me. And I'll say it one more time, stay involved.
Absolutely. Amen to that. Well, folks, we hope you found value in this episode. We'll see you on the next one. Take care.
Thank you.